Northern Dakota, late November. Out here, winter isn't a season, it's a test. The wind doesn't care how hard you worked, how much money you spent, or how confident you sound. It strips heat from wood, from walls, from people. It exposes mistakes fast. On the frontier, winter doesn't argue with you, it audits you. Most men who came north in the 1880s believed they already knew how to survive cold. They had built cabins before. They had chopped wood. They had lived through snowstorms back east. That experience gave them confidence, and confidence can be dangerous when it's carried into the wrong landscape. Dakota winter was different. The cold lasted longer. The wind never stopped. The open land offered no protection. A bad decision here didn't mean discomfort. It meant frostbite. It meant burning through your firewood before February. It meant waking up cold, tired, and behind every single day until spring, if you made it to spring at all. That's the environment where this story begins. Not in comfort, not in theory, in a place where survival came down to simple math: heat in versus heat lost, fuel used versus fuel available, sleep gained versus exhaustion. And in that environment, one man built something that looked wrong to everyone else. They laughed at it because it violated every rule they believed in. A roof that went all the way to the ground, walls that were short, a shape that didn't look like a proper American cabin. To experienced settlers, it looked like a mistake waiting to fail. But winter doesn't care about tradition. It doesn't reward confidence. It only rewards results. What most people misunderstand about frontier survival is this: the people who died weren't always the weak or the lazy. Often they were skilled men using the wrong knowledge for the wrong place. They trusted methods that had worked before and assumed they would work everywhere. Winter exists to punish that assumption. By the time the first real cold arrived, every structure in that territory was about to be measured the same way. Not by how it looked, not by how it was built, but by how it performed when the temperature dropped and the wind started hunting for heat. Some cabins would fail quietly, some loudly. One would change how people thought about building forever, and winter would be the judge. The man they laughed at didn't look unusual at first glance. Mid-30s, broad shoulders, quiet, worked steadily, spoke English with an accent that marked him as foreign but not ignorant. What set him apart wasn't how he talked. It was what he remembered. Henrik had grown up with winter as a constant presence, not an event. In the mountains of Scandinavia, cold wasn't something you prepared for once a year. It shaped daily life. It shaped buildings. It shaped habits. People there didn't talk about beating winter. They talked about living inside it. That difference matters. Most settlers in Dakota had memories of storms. Henrik carried memories of seasons where snow stayed for months, where fuel was precious, where a poorly designed house could quietly kill a family over time. In his world, warmth wasn't about how hot the fire burned. It was about how slowly the heat escaped. He didn't arrive with new tools or modern ideas. He arrived with old assumptions, older than the territory itself. Assumptions built by people who had already paid the price for getting winter wrong. Where others saw open land, Henrik saw wind exposure. Where others saw dirt, he saw insulation. Where others wanted tall walls, he wanted mass and shelter. He wasn't trying to innovate. He was trying not to repeat mistakes his ancestors had already made centuries earlier. That's why he didn't argue when people questioned his plans. He didn't explain much, either. He understood something most people don't like to admit. You can't convince someone with words when their confidence comes from experience that hasn't been tested here yet. So he worked quietly. He measured. He dug. He built according to principles that had survived longer winters than this one. To his neighbors, he looked stubborn. To himself, he was being careful. That distinction is important. On the frontier, stubborn men die early. Careful men last. Henrik wasn't betting against winter. He was betting with it. And the structure he began to build wasn't designed to impress anyone riding past on horseback. It was designed to pass a test that hadn't arrived yet. And when that test came, memory would matter more than confidence. To understand why everyone thought Henrik was wrong, you have to understand why they believed they were right. American frontier cabins followed a design that worked where it came from. Raised floors kept moisture away from timber. 8-foot walls gave space to live and work. Steep roofs shed rain and snow quickly. A stone chimney pulled smoke up and out. This wasn't guesswork. It was hard-earned knowledge from decades of settlement in the East and Midwest. In Pennsylvania, Ohio, and parts of New York, these cabins made sense. Winters were cold, but not relentless. Snow came and melted. Wind had forests to slow it down. Firewood was abundant and close. A cabin that leaked heat could still be kept livable with enough fuel and effort. That experience shaped belief. By the time these men reached Dakota, they weren't beginners. They were builders. They trusted their methods because those methods had worked before. And when something works long enough, it stops being questioned. But Dakota was not Pennsylvania. The land was open. Wind had miles to build speed. Cold settled in and stayed. Trees were sparse. Firewood had to be hauled long distances or cut from limited shelter belts. Losing heat wasn't just inefficient, it was dangerous. The problem wasn't poor craftsmanship. These cabins were built well. The problem was surface area. Tall walls exposed more structure to the cold. Raised floors allowed wind to strip heat from below. Thin walls bled warmth faster than a stove could replace it. Yet none of this was obvious in November. Early winter felt manageable. Fires burned. Cabins held. Men assumed they were prepared. That assumption was reinforced by pride. Nobody likes being told that what they know doesn't apply anymore. So when Henrik laid stones low to the ground, instead of building up, when his walls stayed short and his roof began sloping downward, instead of rising high, it didn't look cautious. It looked ignorant. The settlers weren't laughing because they were cruel. They were laughing because experience had taught them that proper cabins looked a certain way, and this wasn't it. What they didn't understand yet was that experience is only valuable when it matches the environment. And Dakota was about to prove that difference with numbers, not opinions. The real laughter started when the roof began to come down. Not collapsing, not sagging, coming down by design. From the center beam, the roof sloped outward and kept going past where walls were supposed to end until it met the ground itself. To anyone riding by, it looked unfinished, like a mistake frozen halfway through construction, like a man who had miscalculated and was too stubborn to admit it. In frontier logic, a roof touching the earth meant rot animals and collapse. You lifted buildings up to keep them dry and safe. That rule was rarely questioned. Henrik questioned it immediately. He understood something simple: air steals heat faster than soil ever could. Cold wind strips warmth in minutes. Earth takes it slowly, very slowly, and in winter, slow loss is survival. The roof wasn't just a roof, it was a shield. By bringing the roof all the way to the ground, Henrik removed the weakest part of most cabins, the joint between wall and floor, where wind crawls in and never leaves. There was no exposed edge, no underfloor draft, no place for wind to build pressure and force its way inside. The ground contact wasn't an accident, it was insulation. That sloping roof also did something else most people missed. It turned the building into part of the landscape instead of an object sitting on top of it. Wind flowed over it instead of slamming into vertical walls. Snow stayed where it landed instead of sliding off and leaving bare wood exposed. To his neighbors, this looked backward. They saw dirt and assumed decay. They saw sod and assumed poverty. They saw an old country design and assumed ignorance. What they didn't see was intent. Henrik wasn't lowering his roof because he didn't know how to build walls. He was lowering it because he knew exactly how winter attacks a structure and where most cabins lose the fight. He wasn't trying to keep weather out, he was trying to slow it down. In climates like this, slowing heat loss matters more than anything else. You don't win by burning hotter fires. You win by needing fewer fires in the first place. The roof touching the earth wasn't a failure of construction. It was the foundation of the entire strategy. And winter was about to show whether that strategy worked. Most settlers treated the ground like something to escape from. You built above it. You lifted your floor. You kept dirt and moisture as far away as possible. That mindset made sense in warmer, wetter regions, where rot was the main enemy. But cold changes the rules. Henrik didn't see the earth as a threat. He saw it as storage. A few feet below the surface soil holds a steady temperature year-round. In Dakota, even in deep winter, that ground stays far warmer than the air above it. Not warm enough to heat a house by itself, but warm enough to slow heat loss dramatically. That difference matters. When heat escapes into open air at 20 below zero, it's gone instantly. When it moves into earth that's sitting 40 or 50 degrees warmer than the air, it lingers. It gets absorbed. It spreads slowly, and it comes back. That's what thermal mass does. It doesn't create heat, it stores it. Henrik's roof and walls weren't thin barriers trying to block the cold. They were thick buffers designed to absorb warmth during the day and release it at night. Fire, heat, body heat, even sunlight on the southern face. All of it went into mass instead of disappearing into wind. This is where most cabins fail. A traditional cabin heats fast and cools fast. You feel warm near the stove and cold everywhere else. When the fire dies down, the temperature drops hard. That forces constant feeding of the fire, constant work, constant fuel use. Henrik wanted the opposite. He wanted slow change, small temperature swings, long heat retention. Earth made that possible. By letting the structure rest against soil, he turned the ground into a thermal battery. Every hour the fire burned, some of that heat was stored. When the fire went low overnight, the structure gave it back gradually. That meant better sleep, fewer wake-ups, less wood burned, less exhaustion. This wasn't theory. It was survival logic refined over generations. In extreme cold, you don't fight winter head-on. You use mass to wear it down. Henrik wasn't building against the land. He was plugging into it. And that single decision, treating Earth as an ally instead of an enemy, would make every other part of his design work when winter finally applied pressure. Cold alone is dangerous. Wind is deadly. Most settlers feared snow load. Henrik feared air movement. He understood that wind doesn't just lower temperature, it steals heat, aggressively pulling it out of a structure faster than fire can replace it. Traditional cabins stood tall with flat walls. That made them easy targets. Wind hit them head-on, built pressure, and forced itself through every seam, crack, and joint. Even well-built cabins leaked, and once wind got under the floor, it stripped heat non-stop. Henrik designed his structure to deny wind leverage. The low profile was intentional. The roofline stayed close to the ground, so there was less surface for wind to hit. Instead of slamming into vertical walls, air flowed up and over the curved slope. Pressure never had time to build. Wind can't steal what it can't grab. That curved, ground-hugging shape did something else. It removed corners. Corners are weak points. They create turbulence, suction, and uneven pressure. Cold air finds those spots and digs in. Henrik gave the wind nothing to hold on to. This wasn't artistic. It was practical. On the open plains, wind speed doesn't just increase discomfort, it multiplies heat loss. A cabin that holds heat at 10 degrees can become unlivable at the same temperature with wind added. Most settlers didn't calculate wind exposure. They felt it and reacted by burning more wood. That works until you run out of wood or energy. Henrik reduced the problem instead of feeding it. By keeping the structure low and smooth, he cut convective heat loss before it started. The wind still howled outside. It just couldn't reach inside. This mattered at night most of all. Wind peaks after dark. That's when people sleep. That's when fires burn low. That's when cold kills. A cabin that leaks wind forces you to wake up and feed the fire over and over, night after night. That exhaustion compounds fast. Henrik's shape let him sleep, not because it was warm like summer, but because it stayed stable. No sudden drops, no cold gusts crawling across the floor, no wind finding a path inside. The shape didn't fight the wind, it ignored it. And on the frontier, ignoring the wind is often the smartest move you can make. Snow was the thing everyone worried about. Too much weight, too much moisture, too much risk. Most settlers built roofs to get rid of snow as fast as possible. Steep pitch, smooth surface. Let it slide off before it can cause trouble. That instinct came from places where snow melted, refroze, and caused leaks. But in Dakota, snow didn't melt, it stayed. Henrik understood that snow wasn't just a load, it was insulation. Packed snow traps air. Air doesn't move heat well. That makes snow a natural thermal blanket. Depending on density, a deep snow layer can insulate as well as thick wood, sometimes better. The mistake most people made was treating snow like an enemy instead of a resource. Henrik designed his roof to hold it. The sod surface gave snow something to grip. The slope was gentle enough to keep it in place, but steep enough to shed water during spring thaw. Snow built up gradually, layer by layer, forming a white shell around the structure. That shell mattered. Every inch of snow slowed heat loss. Heat leaving the cabin didn't go straight into sub-zero air. It passed into snow that was far warmer than the wind outside. That temperature difference bought time, hours of it. Traditional cabins lost that advantage immediately. Bare roofs radiated heat into open sky. Snow slid off and piled uselessly on the ground, while the cabin bled warmth all night. Henrik let snow do its job. The weight didn't scare him because the structure was built to carry it. Timber framing supported the load. The earth-supported roof distributed pressure evenly. Nothing sagged, nothing cracked. What scared other settlers, snow piling up, became one of Henrik's strongest defenses. There was another benefit most people didn't think about. Snow quiet sound, wind noise dropped, temperature swings softened. The interior felt calmer, more stable. That stability affects people. Better sleep, clearer thinking, less stress. This wasn't about comfort in a luxury sense. It was about reducing strain during months when every task was harder. Henrik didn't shovel his roof. He let winter finish the insulation for him. On the frontier, the smartest structures don't try to remove nature. They find ways to let nature work for them. Most people think warmth comes from fire. Henrik knew better. Fire creates heat, but heat alone doesn't keep you alive. What keeps you alive is stability, a steady temperature, predictable conditions, a space that doesn't swing from hot to freezing every few hours. Traditional cabins failed here. Near the stove, the air got hot. Too hot. 6 feet away, it cooled fast. At floor level, it stayed cold no matter how much wood you burned. When the fire died down overnight, the temperature collapsed. By morning, people woke up stiff, exhausted, and already behind. That cycle wears you down. Henrik designed his space to avoid it. The center hearth was modest, not oversized. He didn't need a roaring fire because the structure itself held heat. Warm air rose naturally toward the peak where he slept. Cooler air settled toward the edges where freezing wouldn't cause harm. That vertical temperature layering was intentional. Instead of fighting physics, he used it. Warm air rises. Let it. Sleep where the warmth collects. Store food and tools where it stays cool but unfrozen. Every zone had a purpose. The key was slow change. When the fire burned, heat went into the walls, roof, and ground. When the fire dropped to coals, those surfaces released heat back into the room. The temperature didn't spike, it didn't crash, it drifted gently. That meant fewer wake-ups to feed the fire, less wood burned, more rest. Rest matters more than people realize. Cold kills faster when you're tired. Mistakes happen, axes slip, judgments fail. Stable shelter protects not just your body but your decisions. In other cabins, people chased warmth all winter. They worked the stove like a full-time job. Henrik let the structure do most of the work. Fire was just a supplement. This difference shows up clearly in fuel use. You don't need less heat, you need less loss. Every log saved is time saved, energy saved, safety saved. Henrik wasn't warmer because he burned more wood. He was warmer because he wasted less heat. That's the lesson most settlers learned too late. Heat production is easy. Heat retention is what separates survival from constant struggle. Winter doesn't reward effort, it rewards efficiency. Theory means nothing until the temperature drops far enough to erase excuses. That night came in January. The wind arrived first, then the cold followed hard behind it. By dawn, the air was well below zero. By nightfall, exposed skin froze in minutes. This wasn't an uncomfortable cold. This was the kind that turned small problems into emergencies. That's when the numbers started to matter. In the surrounding cabins, fires burned non-stop. Men fed stoves every 20 minutes just to slow the temperature drop. Wood piles shrank fast. Smoke hung low as chimneys struggled to draw in the heavy air. Inside walls glittered with frost. Water buckets froze within arm's reach of the fire. Sleep became impossible. People took turns tending the stove through the night. Miss one feeding and the room temperature collapsed. By morning, everyone was exhausted and behind. The day started cold, hungry, and already dangerous. Inside Henrik's structure, the experience was different. The fire burned steadily, not aggressively. 3 or 4 logs every couple of hours kept the system balanced. The temperature didn't spike, it held. The warmest air stayed where he slept. The outer edges stayed cool but safe. Most importantly, nothing changed fast. When the fire dropped to coals overnight, the structure carried him through. Heat stored in earth timber and sod released slowly. No sudden cold shock. No panicked wake-ups. That stability showed up in fuel use. By the end of the cold snap, Henrik had burned a fraction of what his neighbors had. Not because he was tougher, not because he tolerated cold better, but because his cabin didn't leak heat at the rate theirs did. The math was simple. Less exposed surface area, less wind penetration, more thermal mass, more insulation. The numbers didn't care who had built more cabins or who sounded more confident in November. They cared about temperature held versus wood burned. Winter reduced everything to that equation. And once people started comparing notes, how much wood was gone, how cold the floors felt, how many times they woke at night, the laughter stopped. Nobody argued anymore, they measured. Because in frontier life, when numbers speak clearly enough, pride goes quiet. What made this situation uncomfortable wasn't that inexperienced men had failed. It was that the best builders had. These were not amateurs. They were carpenters, farmers, men who had built homes that stood for decades back east. Their cabins didn't collapse. Their chimneys drew. Their joints were tight. By every standard, they knew their work was solid. And that's exactly why they didn't question it. Experience creates confidence. Enough confidence can turn into blindness. They assumed that good construction was universal. If a cabin worked in Pennsylvania, it should work anywhere. If it didn't, the problem must be effort fuel or toughness, not design. Winter proved otherwise. The builders hadn't misunderstood tools or materials. They had misunderstood environment. Dakota punished exposed surface area. It punished height. It punished drafts. It punished fast heat loss. None of those problems mattered much back east, so no one had built to stop them. This wasn't ignorance, it was misplaced expertise. Their cabins failed in predictable ways. Cold floors, wild temperature swings, massive fuel consumption, constant maintenance. None of these problems showed up immediately. They appeared slowly then, all at once, when winter tightened its grip. Henrik didn't outperform them because he was smarter. He outperformed them because his knowledge came from a colder teacher. The difference wasn't skill, it was memory. Scandinavian builders had already learned what happens when you build tall in open wind. They had already paid the cost of thin walls and fast cooling structures. Their designs existed because other designs had failed badly enough to be abandoned. American builders were still early in that learning curve here. This is an important frontier. Lesson expertise doesn't travel well without adjustment. A method proven in one place can become dangerous in another. Confidence delays adaptation. The hardest thing for the good builders to accept wasn't that Henrik's design worked. It was that their own methods they trusted were incomplete. Winter didn't prove them foolish, it proved their assumptions local, not universal. And once that realization settled in, real learning could finally begin. Once the arguments stopped, a harder question took their place. If this design worked so well, why hadn't they seen it before? The easy answer was to call it primitive, old country, something people used before better tools existed. That explanation protected pride. It allowed modern builders to stay modern. But it wasn't true. Henrik's cabin didn't come from lack of knowledge. It came from too much knowledge, knowledge refined until only what worked remained. Every feature existed because something else had failed badly in the past. That's how traditional survival knowledge forms. No one keeps a bad idea for 400 years. No one repeats a mistake that kills families. Old techniques aren't guesses. They are data. Compressed data. Each generation removes what doesn't work and keeps what does. Over time, what remains looks simple because complexity has been stripped away. Henrik didn't talk about thermal mass or insulation values. His grandfather hadn't either. They talked about houses that stayed warm with less wood, houses where children slept through the night, houses that didn't rot, collapse, or freeze people slowly. That's engineering without equations. Modern builders often assume progress means replacing the old. On the frontier, progress meant remembering the right things at the right time. Forgetting the wrong lessons could kill you. This is why old designs often look strange when taken out of context. They weren't built to impress. They were built to survive specific conditions. Remove them from that environment and they look excessive or unnecessary. Put them back and they make perfect sense. The settlers had mistaken age for ignorance. Winter corrected that error. Once people accepted that old knowledge could be precise rather than crude, their attitude changed. They stopped asking why it looked wrong and started asking why it worked. That shift matters because when you treat traditional methods as data instead of nostalgia, you stop copying blindly and start understanding principles, and principles can be adapted. Henrik wasn't offering a cabin to copy. He was offering a way to think. On the frontier, that kind of thinking lasts longer than any structure ever will. The change didn't happen all at once. It never does. At first, people just stopped laughing. Then they started visiting. Not to argue, but to look. They brought thermometers. They brought notebooks. Some came alone. Some came quietly, hoping no one noticed. Mockery fades fast when numbers show up. Men who had been certain in November now stood inside Henrik's cabin in February, watching breath behave differently. No frost on the walls, no ice on the floor, no panic feeding of the fire, just steady boring warmth. That boredom was the point. They measured temperature at the stove 6 feet away at floor level at the sleeping loft. They compared it to their own cabins. The difference wasn't subtle. Henrik's structure wasn't just warmer, it was even. No hot zones, no dead zones. Then came the harder numbers fuel. How many cords burned since December? How often did the fire need attention? How well did people sleep? Those questions cut deeper than theory. Wood had to be cut, hauled, split. Every extra cord meant hours of dangerous labor in the cold. Every night without sleep made the next day worse. When builders saw that Henrik used nearly half the fuel for better results, pride stopped talking. Measurement replaced opinion. This is how frontier knowledge actually spreads, not through speeches or books, but through quiet comparison. People adopt what works because they can't afford not to. No one apologized. They didn't need to. They simply adjusted. Some began sketching new designs. Others modified existing cabins. Lower walls, added earth berms, heavier roofs. Few copied Henrik exactly. That wasn't the point. The point was principle. Once mockery turns into measurement, learning accelerates fast. Ego steps aside. Survival takes over. By spring, what had looked foolish in November started to look obvious. Winter had taught its lesson without raising its voice. It didn't shame anyone. It just revealed the math. And in frontier life, math always wins. The real change didn't look dramatic. There were no announcements, no meetings, no declarations that a new way of building had arrived. What happened instead was quieter and far more permanent. People adjusted. One man lowered his walls by 2 feet. Another pushed earth up against the north side of his cabin. Someone else thickened his roof and stopped clearing snow from it. None of them called it a revolution. They called it common sense. That's how useful ideas survive on the frontier. They don't arrive as finished systems. They arrive as small improvements that reduce suffering. When something cuts wood use in half or lets you sleep through the night, it doesn't need defending. It just spreads. These new cabins didn't all look the same. Some were round, some rectangular. Some kept traditional walls on the south side for light and access, while burying the rest into the earth. American habits mixed with Scandinavian principles until the result felt local, not foreign. That mattered. People didn't want to become Norwegians. They wanted to stop freezing. The biggest shift wasn't architectural, it was mental. Settlers stopped assuming that proper meant familiar. They started asking a different question: does it hold heat with less effort? That question reshaped everything. Fuel planning changed. Winter routines changed. People stopped treating fire as a constant emergency and started treating it as a managed resource. Cabins became tools instead of burdens. Even health improved. Less smoke, less exhaustion, fewer cold injuries. Better sleep meant better decisions, and better decisions kept people alive longer than bravery ever did. Henrik didn't claim credit. He didn't teach classes. He just answered questions when asked and went back to work. That humility helped. No one felt lectured. No one felt small. The idea became everyone's. By the time the next winter arrived, the laughter was gone completely. Not because people had been embarrassed, but because they had learned something valuable. The frontier doesn't reward loyalty to tradition. It rewards loyalty to what works. And once people saw that earth mass and shape could turn winter from an enemy into something manageable, they never fully went back. The revolution stayed quiet, but it stayed. The cabin that once drew laughter stood through many winters after that first one. It didn't win awards. It didn't become famous right away. It simply did its job year after year, using less fuel, demanding less effort, and asking less of the people inside it. That's the kind of success the frontier respects. The real lesson wasn't about a roof touching the ground. It was about how knowledge survives. Useful ideas don't always look impressive. They often look wrong until conditions get hard enough to expose the truth. Modern people make the same mistake the settlers did. We assume newer means better. We assume old methods exist because people didn't know any better. Sometimes that's true, often it isn't. Many old techniques were shaped by environments harsher than anything most of us face today. They weren't designed to impress neighbors. They were designed to keep families alive through repeated winters. That kind of knowledge deserves respect. This matters now more than ever. Fuel is expensive. Weather is less predictable. People are rethinking off-grid living resilience and what it means to build something that lasts. The problems feel modern, but the solutions often aren't. The frontier teaches a hard but useful truth. You can't argue with physics. You can ignore it for a while, you can burn more fuel, you can work harder, but eventually efficiency decides who lasts. Henrik didn't win because he was stubborn or clever. He won because he listened to the land instead of arguing with it. He built for the winter he was actually going to face, not the one he remembered from somewhere else. That lesson still applies. What looks primitive may be refined. What looks wrong may be adapted. What works quietly is often what lasts. Winter is still judging structures today. It's still asking the same questions, and it still rewards the same answers.